Credible sources, not just random Reddit leakers, but people at media outlets like Polygon and The Verge, are now offering informed speculation that we could be about to get something pretty interesting from the Nintendo Switch 2 dock. Now, you can make your own judgment on these reports, although I will say that while these outlets may potentially be better connected and certainly carry more reputational risk from a wrong call, they are still commercial enterprises and they know that Switch 2 stuff drives clicks and potentially subscriptions, especially right before Christmas. There are great channels that aren't this one which review the veracity of stuff like this, but my job today is to step back and go, okay, if Nintendo are mixing it up with the dock, is this truly just to give the Switch 2 a power bump for docked play, or are there broader, dare I say more Nintendo-ish considerations afoot that could change the way we experience games, potentially for generations to come? Plus, how might it affect their release schedule, their price strategy, and all sorts of other considerations for now and for the long term? I will say right up front that what I'm not going to do is go into specific technical details. So instead of that, let's make a few assumptions right off for the purposes of focusing the discussion. First of all, let's say that Nintendo finds a way, whether through additional fans or by not surrounding the Switch on all sides, or just with awesome internal cooling, to keep the Switch from overheating even when it is running juiced. There are rumours this way and that about the presence of fans or not, but the objective of Nintendo won't be to have fans or not to have fans, but simply to make sure that the system remains cool enough to take out of the dock without people feeling like they need to check their home insurance for what it says under fire risk. Secondly, let's assume that the Switch dock contains some native way to boost the power of the Nintendo Switch. The original Switch could output 720p in handheld and 1080 docked. Obviously, if the new device does 1080 handheld but 4K docked, that's a big power jump, 4 times in fact, a much bigger proportionate jump from the handheld model than with the original Switch. Some kind of additional juice built into the dock would make some kind of sense. Thirdly, let's assume that we can go with the widely reported concept that you can now see at least part of the Switch while docked, allowing it potentially to display information even while you're playing. Okay, so why would Nintendo go with a power-boosted dock like this? Obviously, one key thing is that it can boost the capability of the Switch 2 natively out of the gate. Games would still need to be compatible with the base model specs, but third parties especially would have a lot more wind in their sails to deliver some absolutely corking graphics, just as they're doing on other rival consoles. This also fits in with the Nintendo philosophy of trying to make components multifunctional, multiplicative as the Zelda team might say. The OLED team noted that they changed the material for the stand from plastic to metal, saying that this is because compared to plastic, metal can be made thinner while still maintaining its strength. The same principle would surely apply to utilizing the space the dock takes up to deliver a better product for the Switch 2. However, there is more potential that the dock could provide. There are already games like Ring Fit Adventure and Mario Party, which are fairly difficult to play without docked mode. Not impossible, and I've certainly played some tabletop Ring Fit before now, but not ideal. However, a dock would allow for all sorts of other sensors and elements of the sort that the Wii used to use that could widen the scope of the kind of games Nintendo could offer. To be clear, I don't think it's going to do anything dramatic out of the gate, but if the dock has some kind of internal CPU that you could plug into, it presumably means that they could run devices that integrate with the Switch hardware out of the dock. Meanwhile, if the Switch 2 does peek out at the top of the dock, then it allows for information to be relayed even while the player is playing in docked mode. Everyone has been commenting, and it's a good comment, that this extra bit of visibility for the Switch and the dock could be a good way for players to see key statistics and other information. But what if that's just a way to subtly ensure that the Switch dock is positioned optimally for Nintendo's purposes? Think about it. As it stands, you could have your dock pointed in more or less any direction, and it wouldn't make a blind bit of difference. But if the screen is visible, you're probably going to have it pointed forward, especially if you get used to the idea that key information does pop up on there from time to time. And if the developers know it's pointed forwards and they're making games that utilize sensors, then they can utilize that fact for their games without intrusive on-screen instructions to arrange the dock just so. So let's imagine that they wanted to have a dock-exclusive party game which involved a kind of grandmother's footsteps, red light, green light style game. The sensor would either be on or attached to the dock, and it would need to be able to scan the room quite broadly. The logic of this is easy to communicate. If you can see the top of the switch, then you can play the game. So you have to creep slowly forward until the switch changes colour, and then all Zebes breaks loose. This would allow for a much more refined movement sensor for a fitness game as well, but it's not just motion sensors that this kind of thing would be beneficial for. A lot has been made of the possibility of the C on the leaked Joy-Con potentially being a cast feature, and I have discussed in the past the potential of a new system to incorporate a casting mechanic to turn the system into, effectively, a Wii U. Having some kind of internal CPU in the dock itself would presumably offer something like this flexibility. It wouldn't necessarily be the best option for all types of play. Anything that's vulnerable to lag would probably not prioritize this kind of mode, but there are games that would doubtless benefit from two-screen play. For one thing, Nintendo do want to one day cash in on the DS and 3DS and even Wii U games through the Nintendo Switch Online service. I don't think they need to break those consoles out yet, and they certainly have other ways to do so. I also agree with Arlo in a recent video where he said that it's not like this is a top priority for Nintendo, but I do think that they see the value in the online memberships, and if they want the next system to have an 8-year-long lifespan, maybe even longer, they're going to want lots of ways to keep people locked into that account system so that they get that regular trickle of sweet repeat income. The emulated consoles are not the only way to keep people on board, and perhaps with the rise of more exclusive games like Tetris 99 and the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass, as well as features like Nintendo Music, it's not even the main way that they can achieve this, but it's definitely something that they will want to explore. Apart from anything else, it would draw negative attention to the service if, a decade hence, they have not substantially changed the offer in terms of the consoles available. And then there are games trapped on the Wii U, Nintendo Land for example, or look at Zelda Wind Waker. Of course, a port to the Switch has been eminently possible for years, and there has even been a good gap, 2022, where such a port could have fitted. But perhaps Nintendo didn't save it just because they really wanted Jeff Grubb to lose a bet and shave his head, but rather because they knew the two-screen functionality they had built for the Wii U could be better serviced on Switch 2. Note also how many Heartland Nintendo franchises were constructed around second screens, or at least with second screens in mind. The original Splatoon, for example. It's quite conceivable that there were ideas from back in 2015 that the team were not able to run with at the time, but which they could with a casting option on the new machine. And even dear old Breath of the Wild, whose map was obviously built around the Wii U pad, could have extra functionality that works with a second screen, and all of this will be helped by the dock having its own processing power so that it's possible to cast to it. I'm not sure Nintendo will want to make this a major draw this time as it was with the Wii U. Double screen gaming has had its time before and it's had its place, and while the DS did incredibly well, the Wii U showed that it's not intrinsically a winner. But a double screen gaming experience was the last promise Satoru Iwata made to outgoing president Hiroshi Yamauchi after Yamauchi-san finished his 51-year stint in charge of Nintendo. It's personal to them, and their ideas often continue, just finding new expression from generation to generation. Time and again, I'm reminded of that brilliant sequence in the January 2017 Switch presentation, where Shinya Takahashi talked the audience through all the innovations from previous consoles that came to be incorporated into the Nintendo Switch. Even, he said jokingly, the GameCube handle. But to be honest, the DNA of hybrid play was clearly in place even back then, with the GameCube and Game Boy Advance link cable, and I don't think the double screen dream will die any more than that one did. It doesn't have to be casting from the screen though. Houses are currently lousy with old Switches. Millions of them have been bought, it seems, and while reportedly there isn't the functionality on these machines to be cast to directly, they could certainly be streamed to, especially over strong enough Wi-Fi. If there's one way to keep people on board the Nintendo train, even as the game has moved on, it's the sense that keeping with Nintendo could unlock value in people's existing systems. That by buying the new thing, you are in some way enhancing the value of what you already have. It is the sunk cost fallacy in action, but why not when it benefits Nintendo and the user base? What if the new Switch dock could beam out to different past machines? Now look, I'd scale back my expectations of what this would be. They're not going to want to lose those profitable double, triple purchases for siblings playing Pokemon and Mario Kart by letting one game be broadcast across multiple systems. But for more niche titles or family-based titles, WarioWare, Mario Party, Everybody Want to Switch, Switch Sports, there is a huge potential in allowing old Switches to be recycled as effectively controllers. The game options might be quite limited, but to be honest, that's probably not such a bad thing if they're just being shoved over to Grandad to play with while he's over for Easter. And if not Switches, why not sound systems? Many televisions have surround sound functionality, which is great, but a lot of people also have sound arrangements or Alexa devices around the room. It's unlikely that Nintendo would be able to interface too much with third-party devices, and even more doubtful that they would want to do so. But if Nintendo had their own tiny speakers that could be dotted around a room or a house, perhaps speakers that were on wheels even, so they'd zoop around underfoot, then the Nintendo Switch could be used as a way to corral all of these devices. But all of this has a broader context. Nintendo wants its generations to go long. They are not in the power arms race, and so they want to build a massive install base and sell a huge volume of games to that install base, maximize it, and only then move on. Transitions between consoles are risky, especially at this point where they only have one console at a time, and while their broader IP expansion approaches are still, relatively speaking, in their infancy. But they also need to Nintendo to surprise, delight, and do things differently. Double screen functionality allows that offer. Nobody else is doing it, and yet Nintendo has had decades to think about how to make it work. But to be honest, with some kind of processing hub in the dock, so much is possible because you could plug in other devices to it and actually have it link in to the game's console itself. Sure, you could plug stuff into the original Switch dock, but if you wanted it to communicate between the console and the new device, the dock would not facilitate that particularly. Let's say, and this is a deliberately silly idea, but Nintendo gave us a 4-game series about folding cardboard, so just hear me out. Let's say they have a game which comes with its own smoke machine. With smoke generated in all sorts of ways combined with LED lights, the machine gives you the sense of ploughing through a, dragon cave. With the controllers rumbling in your hands as the dragon gets near, this could be a far more immersive form of gameplay than usual. I know with all these crazy off-the-wall ideas it makes it sound like I've lost the plot, and for those of you in any remote doubt, let me absolutely assure you I have completely lost the plot and lost it a long time ago, but that doesn't mean I'm wrong to think that Nintendo will want to future-proof their next console with the ability to do things weirder and wackier than just adding a few more pixels to Mario's moustache, mighty and iconic though his lip wig doubtless is. Let's hear from Yoshiaki Koizumi, the man who was the general producer for the original Nintendo Switch and whose name appears on a lot of patents linked to new Nintendo tech recently. He told a Reddit Ask Me Anything once that if you were interested in designing games, he said, I think one of the best things that you can do would be to expose yourself to other kinds of play, not just video games. It will give you a well-rounded sense of the ideas that go around the concept of play. Nintendo does not view this console as something for games so much as a console for play, and I think we need to consider, as Koizumi-san and his team doubtless have, how these potential innovations could affect not just gaming, but playing. However, to bring these things down to earth a bit, I think there are also business and strategic reasons why a more powerful dock than just an inert piece of plastic has particular benefits for Nintendo, and that is because this would allow the potential to future-proof the console in a variety of ways. The original Nintendo Switch had an upgrade path built in thanks to that frankly enormous bezel round the outside. Even from the very start, the expectation always had to be that Nintendo would one day release a mid-generation model that got rid of or substantially reduced that ugly bezel. But there's not such an obvious upgrade path for the Switch 2. However, the dock allows a lot of flexibility in terms of revisions. As a chapter heading on the first Ask the Developer interview on Nintendo's site stated, gaming consoles are destined to be continuously improved even after launch. For one thing, the value of the original Switch was mostly in the machine itself. A pair of Joy-Cons retailed separately for $80, a standalone dock retailed separately for $60, and those prices tell us almost nothing because you can absolutely guarantee that Nintendo are making absolutely bananas margins on these in order to offset the price of the pricey technology in the machine itself. The dock especially strikes me as something that is basically a chunk of molded plastic and a few sockets. It's probably a rounding error in terms of the manufacturing cost of the machine, and yet it's a brilliant addition because it jacks the value up substantially. Why have they never bothered releasing a version of the original Switch without the dock, even though a huge number of people play only handheld? Because it would instantly lose their money, because actually the dock is incredibly inexpensive to produce. However, if the dock had some actual beef in its belly, then things could be quite different. We know console prices are spiking up prodigiously, and Nintendo are not likely to be immune from these pressures, especially considering all sorts of geopolitical risks around access to precious metals, manufacturing bases, and changing trading relationships. They need a future-proofed price, a price that won't kill demand dead on day one, like with the 3DS, but equally one that can sustain for a long time. Bumping up a price is hard. You basically have to replace the model to avoid the consternation that comes with increasing the price of a product already on the market. And even then, you need to justify the increased price of the new model, which is potentially difficult, especially if your objective is mainly to raise the price rather than necessarily to increase the value. Far better, therefore, to have an expensive model that will inflate away naturally over time, something that Nintendo have managed, probably more through luck than judgment, but with some success nevertheless, to pull off with the Switch. But what if Nintendo could disaggregate the Switch from its dock? $400 for the personal model Switch 2, $500 for the family edition. Or a few years later, they could make a slimline Switch 2 sans dock. I don't mean a Switch Lite, that's an audience Nintendo will seek to fulfill in time to come. I just mean a very high-end handheld. You could add back on an OLED screen perhaps, but this would be something geared towards the handheld market specifically. It sounds good and certainly would appeal to early consumers, but there are still flaws with this suggestion. Nintendo wants its consoles to be at the heart of family rooms. Having people playing on their own in the corner isn't as much value to them as building their brand out and exposing lots of people to Nintendo content. It feels plausible, but not necessarily likely, that they could go with a dockless second stock-keeping unit. Maybe 30% likely at the absolute max. But what if they could, in 4 or 5 years before the revision comes out, absorb the capabilities of the original system more or less into the mid-gen, let's call it OLED model? Maybe it wouldn't be absolutely perfect. Now you can release a system that justifies the higher price point because it is objectively massively more powerful as a device, except that the actual hardware backing it up is actually a match for the original system. It's just that it's now all within the Nintendo Switch as opposed to externally on the dock. And potentially this might not be that much more expensive since it is the same hardware essentially, especially if new AI capabilities allow for even better upscaling without necessarily needing to change the component parts. But Nintendo can still package it with a dock, and if that dock doesn't have any juice to it on its own, then they can as they did with the original Switch, whack on a really substantial margin. Of course, another option would be just to offer a replacement dock, a super dock. This might be a way to keep third parties on board once the PlayStation 6 and the new Xbox start hovering in on the scene, but it creates issues too if you have games that can't be played on old hardware. The appeal of Switch is its massive player base, and a specialist dock would mess things up. Plus, the history of modular consoles has not been good. Who remembers the Mega CD, the Nintendo 64DD, and my personal anti-fave, the Sega Mega Drive 32X? If you don't, you probably don't need to campaign for school syllabus reform, as even Sega and Nintendo largely forgot about them at the time they were coming out. Look, I don't know specifically which way they would bounce with regard to the dock, but the point is that Nintendo have options to bounce from having a secondary power source in the dock. It's true that they could have added a super dock to the original Switch and nursed it along a bit longer, but the chance for a power bump revision was largely lost when the Switch OLED launched in the middle of a pandemic, and after a global chip shortage made getting even chips for the regular consoles a challenge. This could be different next time out. Here's one last mad idea. I don't think this will happen. I'd give it 10% maybe, but I'll mention it for completeness. What if the old Switch can use the new dock? Think about it. Anybody who has a new dock, by definition, has already bought a new Switch, so this isn't some way to cheat to acquire a Switch 2 on the cheap. But remember how a sales pitch for the Wii U was that people could play a game in handheld while someone else suddenly wanted to watch the other station? A terrible advertising pitch, by the way, since it made it sound like the Nintendo games were an irritation and not the center of the entertainment environment, but that's by the by. If you could play Switch 2 but also have someone else dock a classic Switch into it to play up-resed versions of classic Switch games, that could have a really broad appeal. Now, all those people who own Switches don't have to bin their old consoles, but can still use them in conjunction with the new machine. They may not want to very often, like backward compatibility, it's something everybody says they want ahead of time, but it is often not used nearly as much as people expect. But it just feels like a pro-consumer choice, and it's not really going to cost Nintendo all that much. Even if there's no upgrading potential at all, it just makes sense, since presumably the connections at the bottom of the dock are still going to be USB-C to allow the classic Switch to dock into the new cradle. But if it can somehow put out those up-resed images to boot, that has to add a little bit of extra sparkle to an old system. Indeed, if Nintendo did decide to sell the dock and console separately, they may find that they do a good trade in the dock in the short term, and then as the original Switch games dry up and people still feel invested enough, they may ultimately spend more in getting the new console separately down the line than they would have spent if they went all in on Switch 2 from day one. After all, presumably the dock and the version of the Switch without a dock would individually be more expensive than if you bought them together. Again, I don't really think any of this is likely. It gets too complicated, too fussy, and I think ultimately Nintendo wants to keep things simple. New console, new rules. But the potential is significant, and it does give them a lot of different options to play with, options which I know that Nintendo will be thinking about how to exploit to their fullest. Check out some of my previous videos on Switch 2 related shenanigans on screen here. Thank you as ever to my Patreon community and to everybody who likes, shares, subscribes and comments, and I will see you soon for another Nintendo Forecast. Thank you so much. Bye bye.